Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Groundwork / Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we are always in the liminal space of that name change. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and on this show, we explore the threads of what it means to be humans interwoven in this earth. And I think that my guest today weaves that tale of economics, of climate, of fire and human history, of how we think about and steward land, of Indigenous communities and First Peoples in a way that is absolutely incredible. And I'll say this, I haven't made so many notes in the margins and pulled quotes and just had a book that lingered with me in this way in a while. And I think that Jordan's prose and structure is absolutely stunning, and the vulnerability that he chooses to share as he weaves in his own life in the book, which is really an exploration of several different things. It's about fire and our historical relationship with fire and how it's been used to tend and to steward and create fertility for landscapes by Indigenous peoples for a very long time, and what eventually begins to break that relationship and the rise of sort of capitalism alongside fire suppression, and then looking at our warming climate and what that is doing to wildfires. And it's really incredible the way that he explores this as he shares his transformation and journey in becoming a wildland firefighter on the Los Padres hotshot crew, and getting to see this in a very different setting firsthand, and feeling that tension around fire suppression and how we do and don't use fire and climate change. And he does it in a way that is just so beautiful. And I think that Jordan and I could have gone on for many hours, and there's so much that I didn't get to discuss with him that's in the book. And so I really encourage you to pick up this book. And I'll tell you one thing I did not get to talk to him about that just feels so important to mention at this outset is we've talked a lot about labor on this podcast, and I didn't realize this, but wildland firefighters are seasonal contract workers that do not have benefits and are paid minimum wage. And Jordan talks about the sacrifice zone of these bodies, right, as they are exposed to obviously massive amounts of smoke and chemicals. And it really actually speaks to a recent episode that I did with Mariah Blake about forever chemicals and PFAS. So I encourage you to check that out. And actually, on that note, I want to say that in the show notes, I've been including episodes that reference and talk to the episode that you're listening to. And this one has some really big ones. My explorations of becoming more knowledgeable about fire with Brock Dolman, my conversation about consumption and fire with John Valiant, my recent episode with Marguerite Holloway about forests. And so in those show notes, I just have kind of a little bit of a picture of how I'm starting to weave these things together, because as Jordan points out in this episode, I can get a little bogged down in all the things that are pinging around in my little brain. And I have to say that Jordan was an incredible champ on just letting me volley ideas and having a sort of unfurling and meandering conversation with me. Become a little self-conscious that as a podcaster, I'm not great at asking questions. And so that's something that I am forever working on improving. One of the last pieces that I'll mention is just the complexity that Jordan is able to hold in this writing, that there is so much nuance and complexity and interwovenness, and that this is not a straightforward set of topics, that he says megafires emerge from a series of fractured relationships between fire, the land, our institutions, and each other. I just want to speak about Jordan does a really good job holding complexity and nuance and all of the stakeholders in this conversation. This is not a straightforward thing to explore. And I'm really appreciative of that. You know that I love complexity on this show, that I love tension and paradox and how we unpack nuance through long form conversation. I wanted to read you just a little quote just to get our wheels a little greased in this. So in the book, Jordan says, "The era of fire suppression did not begin as a war on fire per se, but as a war against any life that could exist apart from modern capitalism. Commercial classes around the world built moral justifications for the forceful enactment of their financial interests. The result was the suppression of flames, along with the lives and livelihoods of the people who depended upon them. Fire suppression is as woven into the foundation of our modern economy as the factories, laborers, and fossil fuels that have given our society its material form." Some of you might know that I've been in the middle of 2 economics fellowships, and so that definitely shaped this particular conversation. And I think that it is that idea, right, that there are ways in which we think and look at the world that forms the foundation of how we build our world. And then that built world becomes a part of how we transmit culture, and we're inculcated in it, and then we propagate it. And so I think that change takes recognizing that recursive cycle and being able to begin to break that circle, which is something that you'll hear us talk a decent amount about on the show. And with that, I'm incredibly grateful for Jordan for this book, and I'm really grateful for your listenership. These are the kind of conversations that you are fueling and that you are providing the tender for. And I've gone through a lot of life changes in the last 2 months, and it's really made me clear that this podcast matters to me a great deal. And so your support, whatever that means, there's ways to support in the show notes. Best way to support is always to hit subscribe so you can hear some really exciting episodes we have coming up that will, I think, talk to this one as well. And share it with a friend or on social media. That is really how this podcast grows. And I am forever grateful for your listenership. And so with that, here is this incredible conversation with Jordan Thomas and his new book, When It All Burns, Fighting Fire in a Transformed World. How's your morning?
It's going really well. Yeah. How's yours? Where are you calling in from?
The border of New York and Vermont, right south of the Appalachians and next to the Green Mountains.
Oh, you're in the Northeast. Okay, I didn't know that. Beautiful.
I am, yeah. I'm from Colorado, though, so this is an ecosystem that doesn't feel, it's new to me.
Well, yeah, very different kinds of mountains where you're at, right?
Yeah, very different kinds of mountains, very different kinds of forests, very different kinds of ecologies, everything about it.
Where are you from in Colorado?
I'm from Denver.
From Denver, okay.
But I live very rurally now.
Okay.
Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up near Kansas City, so Colorado is the nearest mountains to us, so it feels kind of like home to me, too. We'd go there all the time.
Plains feel like home to me too, actually. I
They
loved
do.
heading east from Denver when I was a kid.
I do not hear that from very many people,
Oh my
especially
gosh.
from Colorado. Wow.
It's such I think it's a really underrated, most of Colorado, the mountains, it takes you a minute to get to the mountains as you cross
I,
the
tr-
state.
I try to tell people that. People they all think that Kansas is flat, but I think just as much of Colorado is flat
Oh
as
yeah.
Kansas.
Yeah, and I think there's something special about a grassland to me. I think there's
Yes.
something amazing about a prairie, just from an ecosystem standpoint, and I like them.
Yeah, where they still exist. It's not quite as special as
Yes.
seeing monoculture corn for
No, I'll tell you what,
hundreds of miles.
and then I'll give you the kind of rundown. I got to stand on, this was many years ago, a little bit of unplowed prairie. It had never been touched. It was
Oh
just
my gosh.
where was it? Was in Kansas, outside of the Land Institute, and I can't
The
think
Land
about exactly.
Institute. Yeah, yeah. I have
Yeah,
friends who work there.
yeah, I was visiting, this was probably 10 years ago. I was visiting with Wes Jackson, and I got to stand on this little patch, right? And it's on a hillside, in the same way that you find old growth in these really inaccessible, tight little corridors,
Yeah.
right? And I got to
Wow.
stand on this little patch of prairie, and it was something. It was something really special. There aren't really words to describe it.
I'm glad you got to experience that.
Yeah.
It's a really special thing. And it's hard to explain the prairie to people unless you've been to a place like that. Like I think people can kind of intuit what you mean when you talk about standing in an old growth forest, but um, I'm glad you had that experience with prairie as well.
Yeah,
Which ties into fire too.
it does. Yeah, it ties so much into fire, which is, I have to tell you, I don't think I hope this isn't offensive to you. I don't think I've marked up a book so much in a long time. I mean, my ARC copy is just covered in notes and underlines and exclamation points. I just enjoyed this. And the way that you wove together all these topics profoundly.
That's
So,
good to hear. It's good to hear. I'm
yeah.
excited to hear some of your thoughts and questions during this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'll have questions for you too, because this is a very open-ended topic that impacts everybody. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah. I love
I have
that.
I have my own experiences in it, but I think like especially from Colorado, everybody sort of seems to come to this area with your own experiences that can speak to the topic too.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of exploration of wood and the history of our relationship with wood throughout civilization on the
Oh,
podcast. So, and have kind of hit several different points. I had John Valiant on, and we talked about fire weather, but we also talked about the golden spruce a lot. Had John Perlin on to talk about forests and civilization, and I this is a passion of mine. So.
I can't believe I didn't see those ones. The last one of yours I listened to was the one about mussels, and I really liked that
Oh,
one. I liked that one a
yeah.
lot.
Oh, I'm so
Wow.
glad
Okay.
you dipped into Bonnie Sui. Yeah, thank you for listening ahead of time. Not many people do that.
Really? Oh, I'm a big admirer of yours. I mean, I counted your podcast when you invited me on, but I've been listening to it quite a bit since.
Thank you.
I really like the way you engage with people and topics.
Thank you. That means a
Yeah.
lot. Before we get rolling, I have us recording just because I never know when things are going to drop in, but I want to make sure you don't have what your hard out is so that I respect your time. And
I have to be on the road at no in 3 hours. So I think
okay. Okay, we have plenty of time. I have more notes on here than we're ever going to get to. And so that's the other thing I do like to tell people is I look to this side of my screen because I have more notes than we could ever touch on over here. So I just like to let you know that. And anything can be edited out after, so be comfortable. You're not glued to your chair or anything.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm sure that'll help me be a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, sometimes you feel like you can't get up, and you can definitely get up, go to the bathroom, eat a cookie, whatever you need to do. I've had people do
Thank
it
you.
all. Let your dog outside.
There's a slight chance I'll be bombarded by leaf blowers, but I hope that that's not today.
We can
So
edit that out too.
okay.
It's all easy. Gosh, I really didn't know where to start on this. I was so struck by all of it. And so one place I thought about just starting, because I do want to give listeners a little bit of your background, is And this book represents a massive transformation for you. Where we meet you at the beginning of the book in Cambridge is a very different place than where we find you afterward. And I'm sure that transformation is ongoing. I don't want to imply that it's reached an end, but I think it was interesting to parallel your transformation as you look at the transformation of these landscapes and of fire historically and into the era of climate change and megafires. And so, yeah, wonder if you can speak a little bit about that transformation of writing this book.
Yeah, it's really, well, I guess it shows that you were a really thoughtful reader, that you noticed that as well. Because it's, well, in the book, the way that I entered this topic knowing very little about fire in California. So that actually helped me a lot when I was writing about it, because I was sort of able to just try to carry the reader through my own process of learning about fire in California in a very intense way, right? Both through a PhD, but also by joining an elite crew of wildland firefighters. So there is that. There is the process of using myself as a vehicle to kind of carry the story. And of course, whenever you're carrying a story over the course of years, you're changing too, right? So just being sort of honest and vulnerable about how some of those changes occur. It's part of the process of storytelling. But then there's also this broader theme in the genre of climate change writing in general that I've been thinking a lot about, which is how do we connect these big global ecological processes to places and locations and events, but also to people's own bodies and lives and experiences and romances and love lives and heartbreak and all these things that, like, climate change really is wrapped up in now, because it's not something that's in the future. It's a process occurring now. So how can you tell those stories? And a very just reasonable way for me to do that was, well, I didn't even really do it intentionally. I was just using myself as a way to tell the story, and it kind of came through that way. But it also felt like a sort of like a responsibility too, because I was writing about people I was very close about as well. So why would I exclude myself from this story when I'm very much a part of it? Yeah. So those are the different aspects of, I guess, my personal involvement in the story that I'm telling.
I think that was a great way of putting it, and I think that you did it so deftly in the way that you're right. Climate change is personal. It's inside of us, right? It's changing our bodies. It's intimate. It's changing our relationships with one another, with land, romantically, and I really felt that, and I felt a sense of connection, I think, in the book that I'm going to say that I don't always feel in this genre of writing. I mean, just a deep sense of impact. So it came through.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really nice of you to say. I had kind of an intuition that these sorts of this feeling of being unmoored and these feelings of discombobulation that I felt after experiencing these unprecedented fires and being on their edges and trying to learn to navigate them. It felt like a really concentrated version of what a lot of people are experiencing as they're trying to make sense of all these other unprecedented changes happening around the planet and how that ties in politically and socially it felt like a way to give it a location and a place that is extreme and intense, but can also hopefully speak to these emotions that I think are becoming more widespread among our generation as climate change gathers momentum.
Thanks for tuning into this conversation with Jordan Thomas. As we explored the complexities of fire and renewal, I couldn't help but think about the materials we surround ourselves with, right? Firefighters are really, their bodies are exposed to a lot of different chemicals, many of which are the same fire retardants that we find in our bedding. And I know that's a bit of a dark connection for an ad, but it is true that most conventional bedding is treated with fire retardants that are packed with chemicals, including PFAS, which we've talked about on this show. They can have serious long-term effects on our health and the environment. And when it comes to sleep, this is really important. I spend 8, 9, 10 hours a day in bed, and so I want that contact to be as great as I can make it, which is why I love Home of Wool for bedding, mattresses, and more. And they're safe, they're all natural, and their wool is GOTS or Ecotech certified, and it offers this incredible breathable option for sleep. It really helps you regulate your temperature, where you're staying cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and they have all kinds of customizable products, from body pillows and pillows to mattresses to comforters. And you can get 10% off using the code Kate Kavanaugh. That's just my name, Kate, Kate, Kavana, UGH. UGH. That's how I used to say it when I was a kid. So 10% off of that at homeofwool.com. And with that, let's get back to our conversation with Jordan. I do too. I mean, I think that there's, you said the word unmooring, and I think that is really telling, right? Because you do a really good job of telescoping between the very local and the very global and individual ecosystems, and kind of how we approach some of these issues as a whole. And so there's the micro and the macro. And I think that we all feel a little bit unmoored and untied to place. I mean, when we were just talking about where we're from, right? And that sort of mooring, and that we are embedded in the landscape and a part of it. And as that shifts so rapidly, of course, we are going to shift with it. I was thinking about, I was fixing fences this week, and the frost heaves push up the poles of the fence, right? Like, so the frost heaves these poles 2, 3, 4 feet out of the ground.
4 feet out of the ground?
Yeah, so you'll
because
have this
the soil freezes and pushes them up?
Yeah.
Oh, that's remarkable.
And it's almost like that, right? There's this almost geological force that's just kind of unmooring, pushing us, moving us around. I can also talk more about frost heaves.
Well, I just love that phrase, frost heaves. I've never heard that before. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Isn't that beautiful? I think a lot about
Frost heave.
Ways in which freezing is anything but, that there's so much movement in freezing when we think of it as something that is static. And so ice needles or frost heaves or glaciers are it's really movement.
That's so interesting. It's usually tied to the idea of stillness. Oh my gosh. I've never thought of that before. I'm going to be pondering that. Thank you. The opposite of fire.
Absolutely. The opposite of fire. Yeah, in some ways. We've talked about both fire and cold refrigeration on this podcast. I think that, we talk about the domestication of fire. And I mean, as you put it in the book, fire kind of domesticates us more than anything. But the domestication of cold and how we harness that is, I think, interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think whenever you're using an element as a vessel of thought, it takes you in really interesting directions too. And that's been one of the joys of thinking with fire for the past 5 years or so, 8 years. It's fire especially it's sort of always been one of the most dynamic means that people can project meaning from the world and make sense of the world and to the world around them. And it's this is kind of the way that I was thinking about it as I was writing the book. Like, fire has been embedded with so much religious meaning, symbolic meaning. Yeah. It's the apocalypse, or it's a purifier, or it's the phoenix. It symbolizes.
It's mythological.
It's embedded in every myth in the world. Yeah. It is fundamental to human mythological systems. And we can try to use scientific terminology to kind of scrub that out of it. But at the end of the day, it's such a symbolic force that we're sort of always leaning on to the myths when we're trying to make sense of it. So thinking about how to do that while writing a book about it, and using that as a sort of way to illuminate different parts of the situations that we're inhabiting now in society and the planet, was was well, yeah, that was a major way that I was thinking about it, because I think that the mythology, the mythological nature of fire is inescapable.
Yeah. I mean that, and also foundational. I think that it is so born out of so many of our stories, whether they are religious or mythological, or I mean even just current real life stories of the land, that fire is inextricable from what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I have this kind of funny question. You don't have to answer it, but you said that you were writing with fire and kind of using that element. And is there anything that stands out in terms of, I don't know, that texture or that speed or that feeling for you of fire on a little bit more of an esoteric level?
Mm. I think what really stands out to me about fire on this level is how relational it is. The fact that it's not a single thing. Fire takes the shape of the places it's burning and the context that it's burning in. And so it's really, so it emerges from the relationships in a very like literal way, in a way that I don't feel like you can encounter very often when you're looking at the world. Or maybe you can, but maybe fire really makes it clear. So, I mean, that's the case in terms of ecosystems, right? The way that fire burns is the way that firefighters think about it is it's a product of vegetation, topography, and weather, right? So the relationship between those three things. But then but then you have to put people into the equation too, right?
Yeah.
And so people's relationship to the vegetation
Yes.
influences the way that the fires burn. And now we're in this really interesting situation where people's relationship to the weather through climate change is also influencing fire. Um, so, so this it sounds kind of fluffy when you talk about it, like fire is a product of relationships. But when you follow this thread or this idea of fire, um, well, it leads into some really dark historical, political, and power dynamics
Yeah.
that helped create these really violent fires that we're seeing today. But you can also see this relational aspect in some of the current processes of people coming together to try to heal relationships between fire and the land. And for me personally too, I would say that I left my years of wildland firefighting with a relatively traumatic relationship with fire. I had a
Yeah.
difficult time moving through some of these landscapes in the same way,
Yeah.
dealing with fire in the same way. But then for me, part of the process of healing that was building a new relationship with fire by working with people and communities to learn what kinds of fire these particular ecosystems need, and becoming a part of that community too, because the community is really, we can dig into that more of what it means to bring back the kinds of fire that the land needs, because I do realize that that's not intuitive for a lot of people who are
Yeah.
accustomed to seeing the Smokey the Bear symbolism and the idea that fire is really just a destructive force. But so maybe I'll put a pin in that one and we can get back to that later
It's
maybe.
funny. I feel like you just described, I mean, I don't have I have a plan for an organic conversation, but I feel like you just described one of the arcs that I imagined for this conversation really well.
Mm.
And so I want to end with relationships. I have a whole little section in my notes about relationships. And so maybe we can get there since we're defining this new relationship, right? You build a new relationship with fire. And towards the end of the book are talking about ways in which we might build a new relationship, but first maybe giving people some of that understanding.
Mm.
And I actually, oh, I wondered if we might start. And I really tried to figure out how to weave all of this together because you do a really good job of describing some of the sort of early rise of capitalism and the ideas of economies as a moral imperative, profit as a moral imperative, and how it completely disconnects people from their life ways, especially Indigenous people here in America, but you also talk some about Ireland, about Sweden. And I was really I was really struck by it. And I put in my notes, the systems, and we could call that capitalism, consumption. And I think that this is, as I was thinking about fire, right? Like there is this consuming force. And I think that capitalism has that same piece, consumption of anyone it views as outside the system that it wants to engulf. And so I don't know if there's a succinct way to bring people into this. I mean, I was struck at talking about Carl Linnaeus, of talking about the Spanish moving into California and the way in which they break Indigenous people's relationship with fire and vilify it. But just, kind of framing that somewhere. Thank you for listening to this conversation with Jordan Thomas about his new book, When It All Burns. As we talked about everything from fire to renewal, I kept thinking about what fuels us in our day-to-day work, because I love a tenuous connection to our ads on this show. And I especially love thinking about what happens to our bodies in the summer heat. That's where Redmond Real Salt's Relight Hydration Powder comes in. It is packed with 60 plus trace minerals and electrolytes like very bioavailable magnesium glycinate, which really does set Redmond apart. And Relight helps fuel my body and keep me hydrated throughout my long farm days and workouts and sweaty summer hikes. And so whether I'm dealing with heat or just working hard, this keeps me feeling my best. And as my garden starts to get going, I'm looking forward to preserving the bounty of the summer. And that also means some pickling and some quick pickling, which is why I love stocking up on their 25-pound bags of salt. So I always have the good stuff on hand. And you can grab your salt and Relight Hydration Powder and so much more at redmond.life using the code mindbodysoil_15 for 15% off. Helps support the show and support you. Now, back to our conversation with Jordan.
Well, maybe I can start with just the very basic premise that fire is fundamental to California's ecosystem. Yeah. So and it has been for many, many thousands of years. But the primary means that fire has been applied to landscapes in California for the past 10 to 13,000 years has been intentionally by Indigenous people in California. And to the extent to which, like, the majority of plants in California, the majority of plant species in California have a relationship with fire. Many plant species in California actually need fire to regenerate. So if I look at the hills outside of my window, the plants covering those hills, the seed banks underneath the soil don't germinate unless they're brushed by smoke. That's how adapted fire is.
Yeah,
fire is California, and California is to fire. It's fundamental. So taking fire away from California is a bit like trying to take rain away from a rainforest. Plants actually need fire here. And so it provides a really good example for a system that's relatively common around the world. For most of human history, people have used fire in landscapes to shape those landscapes in the way that they need, often to produce food, to encourage certain kinds of plants. We think of the origins of humans' relationship with fire as cooking, right? As sitting around campfires. And I think that it's really interesting that we think about it this way, because what that does is it erases this entire spectrum of human relationships with fire outside of just sitting around a campfire or the oven or the home, or however we think of this like domestic sphere of the family. And really, like, very likely before we had campfires, we were, like many other animals, following natural burns across landscapes because of all the benefits they produced. Natural fires would clear land so we could walk through them easier. It would cook some meat. The animals that were in the landscapes would cook tubers. It produces better, more nutritious grasses. So there's all sorts of animals that follow fires across the land, right? And then humans eventually would have learned, very likely, to help spread these and use these and manipulate fires to their own advantage. So this was a primary human relationship with fire and landscapes until for most of our human history until just a couple centuries ago, um, until the origins of capitalism in the 17th century and 18th century, which is when you start seeing the first restrictions on and the criminalization of the use of fire in landscapes. So that's sort of the question, one of the questions that I had, which is who started putting fires out in landscapes and why? And there's a real politics and power dynamic to that question, which in California is just one of the main rounds of drama for how this unfolded in 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 North America. And then that sort of provides a bridge into understanding also where fire went in the rest of the world, and how we can understand these processes elsewhere. So I guess that's the foundation that I would use before I began talking about you know how centralized governments in the last couple centuries started viewing fire as such a threat. So I can dig directly into that, or
I mean, let's do it. I mean, that was a perfect inroads, and I'm going to be thinking about that piece a lot. That we come back to the fire as this place of we're cooking the hearth, the around the campfire, when it's so much more. And I, just before we dive into that more centralized government piece, I was struck by other animals' relationship with fire too. You talk about the researchers telling their students to follow chimpanzee troops if ever there's a fire, because the chimpanzees know what to do. And
exactly.
Just how profound that was to me in defining that this is a relationship, again, to come back to that idea of relationship that not just the human animal has with fire, but that other animals have as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So most people have heard of Smokey the Bear, which is what the Forest Service used as its campaign to convince people that fire is bad. It's not as well known that before Smokey the Bear was the primary mascot of the Forest Service, it was Bambi back in the 1940s, because of the imagery of Bambi running from the fire in that movie. So, and I think that this is sort of the image that a lot of people have of animals and fire. It's like this poor little Bambi deer running from the fire, like terrified. But in reality, a lot of animals flock to post-burned areas. When I say flock, I mean especially birds. Bird activity increases in post-burn areas magnificently.
Birds are seed. I mean, they love seeds, and birds of prey. Yeah,
exactly.
Makes sense.
It also helps them find other little like mice and other critters to eat. But there's all sorts of animals that go to burn areas for different reasons, different benefits. And yeah, so humans are not necessarily exceptional in our relationship to fire. And it's interesting, and cross-culturally, I think a lot of people have heard of the myth of the Greek myth of the discovery of fire, Prometheus going and stealing fire from the gods and bringing it back to humanity, and then he's cursed. He's punished by being tortured for eternity. And so it's a man going and discovering fire and taking fire from the gods, right? But in a lot of other cultures with land-based relationships with fire, the deliverer of fire to humanity in the mythological systems is an animal, or fire comes it begins in the grasslands or something, or this is where they discover fire and this is where they learn to use fire. So you can kind of map on these different ways of thinking about fire. Is it something that it's usually a man? There's a real gender to this idea of we discovered fire in an immediate sense. A man discovered fire, and then it created this domestic sphere of the hearth where we became human. So man made us human, and so
interesting. Yes.
When I talk about thinking with fire, this is sort of the realm that I'm talking about. Is you can see how even dominant parts of our society have thought with fire, maybe unconsciously by projecting dominant ideas of our like gender dynamics, the nuclear family, etc., onto the past and our relationships with fire, to the extent to which it's commonly thought that a man discovered fire at some point in history, and this made us human because of all the changes that it made, and this was the beginning of the nuclear family, etc. which is
Yeah.
really goofy when you think
It's
about
really
it.
goofy.
And, like, that's
It's
not how
really
evolution
goofy.
works.
No. No, and to think, and I think you talk about this isolated, singular incident that is not in relationship, right? It's above, it's exceptional. It
Yeah.
is, it is, and I think you do a really good job in the book of showing all the different ways that we project ourselves into fire, and certainly the ways it then becomes wrapped up in the sort of recursive notions of culture throughout time. Hi, everyone. If you've been enjoying this show and feel a call to support, I have several ways that you can support the podcast. Right now, and I know this isn't the norm, there are no extra content or perks. It is just an exchange of story for a few dollars a month to help keep this podcast going through my Patreon and my Substack. I've begun to think of this a little bit like being a part of a forest's underground mycelial network. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. You get some stories. I get support in telling these stories. And so if you value these deep dives and the people I bring on, this makes a really big difference. If you want to support the podcast for free, that's the best way to support it, which is by subscribing to the show, leaving a rating or review, and especially sharing this episode with a friend or on social media. Most people find podcasts through word of mouth. And so that is how this is going to grow organically, how it's going to take root and have shoots that spread all over. I really appreciate your listenership, and you can find those ways to support in the show notes. And let's get back to this incredible conversation with Jordan Thomas and his new book, When It All Burns.
Yeah, and I think that actually leads well into the origins of this idea of fire as a really bad thing.
Yeah,
right?
me too.
Which led to its criminalization and the criminalization of the people and the cultures and the lifeways revolving around fire. So in California specifically, but around the world, fire was historically an essential part of food systems. There's around 200 species of plants just in this region in California where I live alone that rely on fire for regeneration. Many of those plants are important for different parts of the food systems of this region's Chumash peoples. That's a foundational level with the plants, but that also relates to the way the game animals are attracted by the correct use of fire in landscapes, and how certain plants in Santa Barbara County, like soaproot, that relies on fire. And if you prepare it in a certain way, it has all sorts of uses. But if you prepare it in a certain way, you propagate it with fire, prepare it in a certain way. If you sprinkle it into water, you can paralyze fish, so then you can just harvest the fish from the water. And this is one of just many, many relationships that fire had to food systems in California historically among California's indigenous peoples. So that's just one small example in one small place, but there are around 200 different languages spoken in California at the time of Spanish arrival. And for every group of people in every different ecosystem, there are multiple relationships with fire.
Yes.
So I can ride my bicycle from my apartment up to the mountain up there, and to the top of the mountain in an hour. And each different part of that ride, just in that hour bicycle ride, I'd pass probably at least 5 different types of fire use historically, if this was the historical landscape that I'd be moving through. Yeah. So 5 different types of fire just from my apartment, an hour bike ride up to the top of the mountain. And each of those were related to the cultivation of particular ecosystems in relation to food and other things. So it's really interesting that when the Spanish arrived in the 18th century in California, one of the very first laws passed by the very first governor was to criminalize fire based on the premise that it was destructive and its users the people using it were childish. And that was So that law was implemented really brutally. I was part of this larger process of subjugating California's indigenous people, because when you're criminalizing fire, what you're doing is criminalizing their food systems,
Yeah.
right? And when you criminalize people's food systems, you turn them into subjects. You
Yes.
you literally subjugate them, which was part of this larger process of trying to turn California's landscapes into extractable, commodifiable systems, right? Which starts with the people. It starts with the element that the people use to tend the landscapes, and then it goes to the ecosystems. And well, I think it's really important to root the history of fire suppression in California to this historical moment, because it's often
Me too.
rooted. It's frequently said that just over a century of fire suppression in California has created these conditions for climate change, etc. And I think it's actually really, the language we use is so important. It's really important to say several centuries of fire suppression, because if we don't do that, we're erasing the ways that the governance of fire in California is wrapped up in these really deeper histories of oppression of California's indigenous people, which is at the foundation of the fire crisis in California, and therefore is part of the process of repairing the landscapes and our relationships with fire now. There's a real imperative of justice and the work of returning fire to the landscapes in California now. So it's not just interesting historically, but I think there's a real ethical imperative to talk about these things when we talk about how these fires have gotten so out of control and the conditions that climate change is now impacting so severely.
I often come back to on the podcast that understanding the confluence of events, right? The very complex constellation of events that leads us to where we find ourselves today, right? And it's not linear and it's not singular, and it is really important for how we reimagine how we might go forward and how we reimagine the systems in general, right? That there has to be this foundational understanding of the systems and their effect on people, on landscapes, and the
Yeah.
relationship between those two things over time. And so I want to say that, and I also want to say, you come back to language so frequently in the book. The way that we talk about fire is the terminology of war, and this is this initial process of, I mean, you say, I have this quote here that I'll read, right? That it was a war of extermination, that the pairing of genocide and fire suppression was no coincidence. According to Bill Tripp, an indigenous fire specialist and member of the Kurun tribe, colonizers blocked cultural burning practices as a deliberate tactic of ethnic eradication. It became part of the policy to remove that connection to the food system. And so I just want to impress, I think it is very important that we understand where we've been, because it is a big part of both the repair of how we move forward and the reimagining of how we move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, I'm glad that you read that quote, because as I was saying earlier, it's interesting that the Spanish criminalized fire right when they arrived. But I think when it goes from being interesting to important, and a sense of what do we do now, is when you can locate that as just one part in a broader system that's
Yeah.
unfolding. And so that quote that you just read about fire suppression being part of genocide was from the policies of the United States that they enacted just over half a century after that first criminalization by the Spanish governor. And it was in the first legislative session that the United States they criminalized the use of fire by indigenous people. And the governor called for a war of extermination to be waged against California's indigenous people. And again, this wasn't just happening in California. The genocide that happened in California from 1850 to 1890 is often considered the most extreme in the history of the U.S. frontier. But the pairing of subjugation and fire criminalization and taking fire away from people and landscapes, and I mean, you can locate that all around the world. California provides, again, a really, really poignant case study for understanding this broader system. And I think that's just important because it doesn't mean that this is just some quirk that we can just fix with some like technological solution, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to innovate our way out of systemic issues. And what I really try to show in this book is that this is a systemic issue that is tied up in the structures of our society. And
Yes.
I'm not even making a normative claim about whether capitalism's good or bad. I'm saying
No.
that fire suppression is tied up in the history of capitalism and our capitalist structure. So whether you like capitalism or not is sort of irrelevant here. It's really just making a factual statement about the relationship and the origins of fire suppression to these systems that we're living in, and the fact that we do have to adjust these systems that we're living in if we want to get a handle on this crisis. And then from there, I think we can just get into the issues of environmental justice and ethics and the really interesting stuff. But
Yeah.
it's a very basic foundation to be working from, I think.
It is, and I think it's an important one. And I think tracking the history of capitalism, just as a normative statement, is important because it's the system that we're living in. It's the waters that we swim in, right? I come back to this idea. There's a David Foster Wallace commencement speech. He made a commencement speech. Are you familiar with it?
I know the one, yeah.
And he opens it with these two young fish are swimming around, and they pass this older fish, and he says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they look at, kind of swim off, and they look at each other, and they say, "What the hell is water?" And to me, this is the milieu that we're swimming in, and so I wanna get into some more of this environmental justice piece. But before I have one quote that I think wraps this up. I mean, and you just said this in short, but you just did such a great job in the book here. You say, the era of fire suppression did not begin as a war on fire per se, but as a war against any life that could exist apart from modern capitalism. Commercial classes around the world built moral justifications for the forceful enactment of their financial interests. The result was the suppression of flames, along with the lives and livelihoods of the people who depended upon them. Fire suppression is as woven into the foundation of our modern economy as the factories, laborers, and fossil fuels that have given our society its material form.
I'm glad that quote stood out to you. That's yes,
It's a big
difficult.
quote.
It's difficult to summarize these big topics and big themes, but that's what I was trying to do there.
It is,
And it's
and you did.
yeah, it's a common idea in the academic field of political economy that people and landscapes and ways of life that are not organized around the creation and accumulation of capital are often viewed by colonists and capitalists as threats,
Yes.
whether or not they actually are. And you really see that with fire. So I don't know if it's relevant necessarily to how relevant it is whether this, for example, the Spanish government or the American government actually thought Indigenous burning was bad or not. But to the extent that we can dig into that, it's just it is a very common theme in looking at the way that colonists and capitalists how they ascribe value to ways of life that are not organized around capitalism, and they're often threatened by it. And you can see this all over the place. It's a really useful theme for thinking about people's relationships to other people and to environments. I have colleagues who work in the Amazon, and it's the deforestation of the Amazon from our perspective in North America looks like it's obviously terrible, right? But from the on the ground level of people actually doing some of the deforestation, they consider it like cleaning, or they consider the actual parts of the Amazon that are still forested to be dangerous or undesirable, and the parts that are clean and desirable are the plantations, the soy farms, the parts that have been cleared. And so I guess that's a little bit of a tangent, but all that is to say that these are relatively these are parts of these systemic themes that we've been talking about, right? Which is, why do people historically view indigenous burning, which it created really resilient food systems and increased the
and really
biological
fertile.
And fertile. And the thousands of years of indigenous burning in California actually increased the biological diversity of California. Most ethnobotanists think. So California was more biologically diverse by the time the colonists arrived than it would have been if people hadn't been there, which I think is really, like, that's worth resting on for a second, because
it is.
With all of the unfolding and cascading environmental crises that we're surrounded by and complicit in now, it's really easy to take the fatalistic approach that humans are the problem and humans are like inherently environmentally destructive, like we don't belong in ecosystem. And I just think that is really important to find concrete examples of situations in which people do exist in ecosystems in ways that are not just benign, but can actually enhance ecosystems and enhance the life around them and the relationships with life around them. And as one of my favorite authors, Robin Wall Kimmerer, writes, for many years, the imperative of indigenous people is to have a reciprocal relationship with the land. So when you're taking things from the land, it's not extractive, right? You're giving back to the land as well, so that it will keep giving back to you, because it's an exchange, it's a relationship. And she writes that fire was the tool that was the vehicle for the reciprocity. That was the gift that people were able to give back to the land. She describes fire as a paintbrush for the landscape. So you can paint fire in a certain way here and you produce blueberries. You paint a certain way there, you produce a meadow for elk. And that is what was viewed as a threat by colonists and by the American government when they first came to California, the Spanish in the 1700s and the United States in the 1800s. And it was this relationship that was really targeted in the process of colonization and genocide.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I do want to rest on that we always view people as the problem, and so to find that concrete example, and concrete examples of how we can live in relationship, in reciprocity with the land is vital. And I actually think that this might be an interesting place to just briefly mention then how this landscape that existed in reciprocity with Indigenous people in California and other places as well was not the wilderness that is then painted. I kept thinking about, while I was reading the book, I'll just tell you this. I've been thinking a lot about shifting baselines. I always think a lot about shifting baselines. And I was thinking about the way that we think now about whether it's restoration or ecosystem regeneration, whatever terminology you want to apply to it, that we are getting back to, and in this case in California, this wild state of nature, when really, right, for millennia, that place had been tended with fire. And so this kind of false baseline that we think that we might be getting back to. And you talk a lot about how we will view the wilderness. And I'll read this just really short little piece. You say, the idea of American wilderness, according to environmental historian William Cronon, was invented gradually. To imagine the land as wild, American colonists first needed to remove indigenous peoples from that land. Then, to imagine the frontiers as untouched, the American public needed to erase indigenous histories of fire and land management. Finally, with landscapes brutally emptied of indigenous peoples and their histories, the dominant figure of colonial society filled the void with their deepest core values: profit on one hand and conservation on the other. And so I just want to pause kind of in this transition place just to briefly touch on this concept of wilderness, that maybe it's not what we've been sold.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, it's been a process. We started by talking about my transformation in the book as I'm writing the book, and that was one of the parts of that. I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, with this idea of the wilderness really impressed on my imagination. So learning, I guess, or realizing the myth of the wilderness was, well, it's not an easy process, especially when you realize the politics and power dynamics and brutality that went into that, and in some ways your own complicity in it as a person occupying the position in society that I do, and as somebody who enjoys going into these areas, right? They don't. They suddenly, it shifts the way that you view them, right? You're not entering this Garden of Eden. You're entering, well, just to be frank, a lot of some of the indigenous people I've worked with on prescribed burns call them these forests that I would have classically viewed as wilderness. They call them genocide forests because they view these forests as products of, like, they're not natural, right? The way that they look now is, and the way that they're configured now, is a product of several centuries of preventing people from using them in the way that they did for tens of thousands of years, which is the frame that many people view fires in California as well when we're experiencing these massive conflagrations. It's it's essentially, I might get myself in trouble here, but I think it's a bit meaningless to talk about whether fire is natural or not in California. Sort of in the same way that we're talking about wilderness, because I don't really know what natural means in California anymore.
Yeah. Do you want to keep going? I don't want to interrupt you. I mean,
yeah,
I agree. I agree.
I think that the idea of that fire is a natural is really just a shortcut that can, or it's a way to not talk about what has gone into shaping these particular fires and what these fires are doing and for whom. And I think that those are the more interesting questions, because California is not a wilderness. It hasn't been since before the Ice Age. So really there's no understanding of California without understanding people's influence and the influence of fire. So you just, and it's not easy. It doesn't make for good sound bites, because that means when you're talking about different fires, you have to really be nuanced and talk about the different relationships historically and institutionally and interpersonally and ecologically that contributed to this fire. And in the same vein, if it's a bit difficult to talk about if fire is good or bad from California, because there's so many different kinds of fire. And so if you want to talk about if a particular fire is good or bad, again, you have to just be able to talk about what is that fire doing and for who, because fire it does a lot of different things. It can be used for a lot of different things. And its damage is not evenly distributed either. So its benefits and its damages are, you just have to really be able to trace those and talk about those if you want to talk about the value of fire or the harm of fire in society. Because, it's interesting in our conversation so far is we've talked a lot about how good fire is historically, or how like the place of fire in California's ecosystems. But I think it's also important to note within that, like, California needs certain kinds of fire, right? But it's also experiencing a lot more kinds of fire that really are harmful and damaging. And it's a balance when you're working on how to communicate these things, to not fall into this historical social inertia of framing fire as this monolithic destructive force, right? With trying to not fall into that, while simultaneously not falling into the other side of saying, like, all fire is natural and all fire is good. Because some of these fires really are extremely destructive and damaging and unprecedented. because the relationships and the conditions they're burning in are also damaging and unprecedented and premised in these violent historical systems. So, as I said earlier, it's hard to get that into a soundbite, but I think that's what's so interesting about this whole topic right now.
Oh, I think I'll say a couple of things really quick, but I think, first of all, I think that most things worth talking about are very hard to soundbite because they are contextual and relational and nuanced and interconnected. And it's very hard to boil that down into a 30-second bit. And I think that's one of the reasons I love long form everything. It's why I love a book. It's why I love a longer conversation. Because it allows these things to unfurl and unravel and to give them the time that I think they truly deserve. I kind of want to get into modern fire, but before I want to say, right, that I appreciated your take on natural, and I wrote as you were talking, right, natural is sort of a monolith that covers all manner of sin. Like, it's just a way of, it is an erasure, I think, in a lot of ways. It's a tricky term that's hard to pin down, it's slippery, and hard to get a hold of. And I think that so much of the book is, there's a lot of tensions there. There's a lot of tension of exploring the history of the suppression of fire as you yourself are participating in the suppression of fire. There's a lot of tension around what you just said, right? That fire isn't just, it's not singular, that it's not just this good thing and it's not just this destructive thing, and that it's complicated and contextual, especially as we enter the era of climate change, which we haven't really gotten into this in this conversation, where the very nature of fire has begun to shift and really change the way in which it behaves. And so, I wonder if you might bring us into this era of climate change. And, you become, in the course of this book, a hotshot firefighter, and get to see on the ground what these very different fires are doing, and different both in a historical context and different from one another, because each fire is, again, this confluence of factors that's very contextual.
Yeah, so one of the things I was really wrestling with while I was a wildland firefighter was my complicity in these systems that I could locate in these really messed up histories, right? The history of fire suppression can be traced directly back to these really terrible historical moments, and this is where wildland firefighting stems from, really, right? I was a soldier in the war against fire, which has these origins and these problematic histories, and firefighters call this the firefighter's paradox, which is the more we fight fires, the larger they grow, but they're also already so large and so altered that we have no choice but to put them out. Thank
you for that. Paradoxes are one of my favorite things to unpack on this podcast.
And when you find them, I think they're very interesting places to sit with, right? Because I mean, a lot of reality is not logical. It doesn't follow clear linear sequences. So when you find paradoxes, I like to sit with them and think about them.
Me too.
And my hope was that, the one way that I was thinking about this is that's again a concrete example of, I think, a paradox of complicity that a lot of people experience with climate change as well, which is we're all complicit in these systems. We're all carbon beings at this point. There's probably petroleum in the clothes that we're wearing right now. It's inescapable, right?
Yeah.
You can reduce your personal carbon footprint, but then, even the supply chains that you get your food on. It's basically incomprehensible to think about how you could remove yourself from the carbon economy right now.
It is. It's in everything. I mean, it is. It is quite literally baked into everything.
Exactly, like microplastics in our blood, right?
Yeah, a whole spoonful in our brain at this point. Yeah, we have become petroleum based in more ways than one. It's in our blood.
Yeah, and I'm well, to be honest, this is something that I still wrestle with personally, and I can't give you a clear answer to how I've dealt with this paradox, other than, well, I do think that there's a limit to how much we can place complicity in individuals, and I think that that's important to do the best you can as an individual while trying to fix the broader systems. So we need wildland firefighters out there because we have put fires out enough, and we've contributed enough to climate change to where wildfires do immense damage sometimes. That does not mean that we shouldn't also be trying to alter the structures of the forest. The wildfires, when they do burn, are not so violent and intense, right? While simultaneously trying to transition society off of fossil fuels. Because I think it's really important to note that it's great to talk about forest management. It's great to talk about how we can change the structures and systems of society to create a good relationship with fire. But none of this will matter if we keep burning fossil fuels at our current rate.
Yes.
It just won't. There's no forest management strategy that will suffice if we don't get a handle on climate change by stopping burning fossil fuels, by getting fossil fuels out of our economy. So it has to be multiple things in lockstep happening at the same time, right? You have to be decarbonizing society, building a better relationship with fire and forests through prescribed burning and forest management, and building these personal relationships on the ground. So I can get deeper into how climate change impacts fires or prescribed burning, or I'm curious where you would want to go from here. Okay.
I have all kinds of thoughts on where we could go. I had a little bit about firefighting as war and industry. I think I might have glommed onto the capitalism piece on this. It might have just been reflective of where I was in my personal life. You know how sometimes we kind of hang on to something. But I really do want to get into some of the different ideas of how we might interact with landscapes as well. And I mean, maybe I'll offer this too. Just as you were speaking, there's a great plastics researcher named Max Liaboron. I'm going to have to look up that name. And they have a great analogy and it's in talking about plastics, right? And it's that you're filling up a bathtub. And if it starts to overflow, the first thing you do isn't necessarily to go grab a mop. It's to turn off the tap. And then maybe you go grab a mop, right?
Thank you. I need more of these very simple ways of thinking about this. It's so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And so that really echoes for me in this situation too, right? Is that you have these megafires that are being fueled by climate change and the burning of hydrocarbons, the burning of fossil fuels, and the use of plastics in literally everything. And we do have to clean up these fires and to fight these fires, but we also have to turn off that tap that is really fueling their growth.
Yeah. Exactly.
And we can go from there. I just wanted to offer you that because it kind of connected. I'm doing simultaneously to this, and this might be why I glommed onto capitalism. I was doing several podcasts about plastics and PFAS and the historical collusion of governments and capitalism in the creation of these chemicals. And so you really dovetailed into that. And so I think that's part of why I hooked into this, is because I was looking at plastics, and then you brought in Agent Orange and the FOSS, all of these different chemical companies that had come from war backgrounds and come into firefighting, and then how that sort of dovetails into disaster capitalism. And so I think that was where my glomming happened.
It's incredible how much you have to keep in your mind doing your job with podcasts and how much information you're constantly juggling. I think it makes for some really interesting hybrids of thoughts between different areas. It's part of the reason I've really enjoyed talking to you. Do you want me to? So I can talk about the fire industrial complex.
Yeah,
or I can go straight into climate change. Each one,
let's touch the fire industrial complex, at least here for a second, because it is impressive. It's big. And so it just, whatever feels most relevant to you, we can either do historically or we can just kind of take a little peek at disaster capitalism. But
let's just take a little peek at it. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the sequence of events that have created the conditions that climate change is now blowing up in terms of these huge fires. So there was the colonialism, there was genocide. Those were the foundations, right? You erase, you take people out of the landscapes, you erase their histories, and then you fill those landscapes with commodities. And a lot of California, those commodities were plantations. So, especially in the north, a lot of the forests that we, again, think of as wilderness are actually the result of historical clear cuts across landscapes, which is where you just take all of the trees off of the side of a mountain, log them all, and then you replant that mountainside with one species, whichever species is fetching the highest price at the time. So you fill the landscape with commodities, and then you have to protect those commodities, right? Because if these plantations burn, that's a huge cost. So this is where the fire industrial complex comes in, and the idea of the fire industrial complex comes from the military industrial complex, which is the collusion between industry, government, and the military. And in the case of fire, it's the intersections between the government, the firefighting agencies, and industry. And it's not just a conceptual mapping on of each other. It's a genuine. The United States government after World War II took the structures of the U.S. military and took a lot of the actual material from the military, such as airplanes, people, even a lot of some of the machines, and took that and applied them to the landscapes of the United States to treat fire as an enemy, and to really effectively take fires out of landscapes to protect industry. And with that, it's the industry of firefighting has grown in tandem with the growth of fires, just as the military-industrial complex and the U.S. military budget has grown. And in recent years, or recent decades, since about the 1980s, a lot of it has been privatized and shifted to a contract-based system where there's an increasing reliance on private wildland firefighting crews that are for-profit, the chemicals that are dropped on fires to try to put them out. Sometimes you'll see airplanes dropping this pink retardant. Those are that's a chemical called Phosgene, which has ties to Monsanto from back in the day. It's not owned by them anymore. It's owned by a corporation called Perimeter Solutions, which has a monopoly on that industry. All of which is to say, without getting too pedantic, is that there's a whole lot of money invested in putting fires out now. Yeah. And that's not to say that there's a conspiracy to keep fires big or to make fires bigger to put them out, but it is to say that the incentive structure is not in favor of getting a handle on this crisis, because there's simply not a relative amount of money in like forest management, right? That costs the public, while putting fires out makes a few people and a few corporations a whole lot of money. Mm-hmm. So this is a really good example of capitalism sort of being a snake that eats its own tail, or yes. People learning to profit from the disasters of climate change, even as they make climate change worse. And it's really a bit disturbing, because I think that there's this assumption for a lot of people in society that climate change will reach a point where eventually it'll just get bad enough to where people will decide to act on it. People as in powerful people who make a lot of money right now. But I'm not convinced, after being on the front lines of these fires, and they're already extremely destructive. They already harm a whole lot of people. They even harm quite a few rich people in California. Mm-hmm. And yet, the incentive structure simply is not there. It's still way more difficult to get political support for forest management than it is for dumping more retardant on these huge megafires. And it's a lot of that's because the political support requires funding from the federal government to take care of these fires, and that's that's hard to get in the United States. And again, we could go so many
More
directions
so
with this
now.
talk.
Well, why don't I say this? I was interested that you referenced Ouroboros, right? That this was a bit of a snake eating its own tail, because I wrote on a sticky something Nez says in the book, and it's something along the lines of, right, a circle is the strongest shape, but it's also the hardest shape to break.
Yeah.
And so when you were saying that, when we get stuck in these recursive machinations of systems, they're very hard to break out of. It is very hard to change, to shift. Yeah, I don't know, that circle piece. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. I don't know if you've read Tim Morton's Dark Ecology, but I'm always fascinated by looping and circularity and how it shows up culturally.
Yeah.
And so with that, I think let's touch this climate change piece before we begin to think about what it might mean to break that circle, to break that cycle. And so how have these fires gotten bigger, right? We've kind of touched on how fire is good, but these are fires in a different order.
Yeah, so it seems like every time fire season rolls around in California, there's this, what I consider to be a false debate that emerges, which is whether these fires are caused by climate change or something else, such as forest management. And the reason I call this a false debate is because it's always both. Because climate change always burns in the contexts that have shaped it. And climate change is now part of that context, right? So climate change is interacting with these histories of forest management that have made our land so vulnerable to fires. And often, so I think like climate change is also always a very contextual thing. And usually the most violent impacts of exactly. And the most violent impacts of climate change often land in places with the most violent histories, like California and our forests. As we said, they're like these forests are products of very violent processes. So when I'm thinking about how fire very easily becomes a symbol of climate change, right? But I think it's important to at least break it down into two categories. There's the acute effects of climate change on wildfires, which is, you can think of it like heat waves. When we're experiencing a lot more frequent heat waves in California and around the world because of climate change. And what happens when it's that hot, when it's like 115 degrees or 120 degrees, the moisture just gets sucked out of the vegetation. The land is brittle, the land is dry. And
into the roots.
It's like into the roots, yeah. And it is extremely difficult to stop a wildfire when it's that hot out. And it would be that case in the best of conditions, right? Even if we had healthy forests. But you layer on top of that the chronic impacts of climate change, which is more widespread heating over broader spaces, right? I think California's temperature's gone up about, what would it be? Well, I'm not going to give you the wrong number, but California's temperature has increased significantly since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Just a couple degrees, not enough for you to even notice if the temperature in the room went up that much, right? But when you apply that across landscapes, the effects are profound, because I've heard it described as like an atmospheric sponge. When you increase the temperature of the air, you suck that much more moisture out of the plants, right?
Sure, yeah.
Which actually has a profound influence on fire. And again, it would even in the best circumstances, but layer on top of that droughts, increasing heat waves, and layer this on top of the environmental conditions that have been created by the suppression of fire for the past couple centuries, and you get a really explosive situation. So, for example, we're not talking about really healthy forests. We're talking about forests that were planted with like one species of tree really close together. these are not resilient ecosystems. So when you get more droughts, when you get more heat, you get a lot more forest die-off. A lot of these trees die. And there's been a lot more fuel accumulated, a lot more like leaf litter and branches and bushes and small shrubs, and it's called biomass. There's a lot more biomass, which translates to energy that can be released as flames. And these have been built up over centuries in these really unhealthy forests we manufactured. So that now with climate change, you put a drought on top of that, a lot of it dies. They're more susceptible to pests like bark beetles, which historically, bark beetles were they kill some trees. That's part of what they do. But then they were kept in check by like winter, by the temperature at different elevations. But the winters don't often freeze enough to kill them now, and they can go to higher elevations and higher latitudes. So this, what used to be just a regular part of ecological moderation, which was these pests, all of a sudden becomes a scourge that kills millions and millions and millions of trees, to where, and all of this is wrapped up in the chronic effects of climate change, right? Climate change is what has unhinged these pests for these ecological conditions, and it's what's helped make these forests, which are already not healthy forests. It's the word firebomb is often used to describe them, which is not even necessarily hyperbole, because you get whole like ranges of mountains that are filled with dead, dry trees. And that's really hard to fix. That's really hard to stop when a fire burns through there. So these historical and systemic factors that we've discussed, which like colonialism, genocide, industrial forestry, the fire industrial complex, I think of these as being the fuel for the fires, and then climate change being the match that we've dropped on top of them.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pause there. I would just pause for again, how relational and contextual and complex this is. That it's not any one thing, that it is layered on top of one another. And I also want to pause, and I want to make sure listeners here, I mean, I was really struck by force that we've manufactured. That really struck me as a way of thinking about this. And it's an uncomfortable way of thinking about it. I think in the same way that you talk in the book about a new way of seeing these landscapes that we might interact with recreationally, right? That idea that they're manufactured to this degree is hard. Yeah. I mean, what a complex interplay of factors. And I think that this is what we're experiencing everywhere. And California is experiencing it at this particular level, but even beetles, right? I feel like everywhere has a beetle that they're struggling with. There's the pine beetle in Colorado. Out here back east, it's the ash borer beetle. That is changing forest ecosystems because those winters aren't as long, that freeze period isn't as substantial, and how much these are layered effects of change. And I think honestly, I just want to pause and appreciate the amount of nuance and context that you've put this in for me. It helped me see this again. I'll say I don't think I've written so much in a book in a long time. It really helped me see a different story, and different layers of this story that I think we are in, right? This story is now. We find ourselves in this story of climate change. And so maybe the next place we should shift to is, what other story might we tell ourselves? How might we break that really strong shape of the circle, as Nez says in the book? And what are some of the practices that are more relational? And, I don't want to take up all of your day, though I think I certainly could based on how long my notes are. But I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I'd love to end on relationships. And I think I have some good quotes for us there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the best way into this.
Well,
And
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, did you have an idea?
I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways in, and maybe an easy way in, since we talked about it at the beginning, looking at different interactions with fire and land really helped you transform your relationship with fire. Again, it transforms multiple times throughout the book. And so maybe that's a way into how it takes something that, and we didn't get a chance to talk a lot about your time as a wildland firefighter, but getting to spend time in the book with different people throughout California that are working to bring different practices of burning and fire back to the landscape, I think really, I don't want to say that it heals, but it definitely, it felt like from the book that it soothed something for you that was hurting.
Healing is something that people involved in these prescribed burn communities, it's a way that they describe the kinds of fire that they use often, actually. They describe fire as medicine, and they describe it as medicine for the land, but also for themselves and for trauma from these catastrophic fires as well. So a fair amount of people who've gotten involved with prescribed burning in California actually get involved after they've had traumatic experiences of having their communities burned or their homes burned. And
Wow.
I didn't really expect that when I got into this. So after I finished being a wildland firefighter, I was having a difficult time even going to places that I used to really enjoy and like woods that I used to enjoy walking through or mountains that I used to enjoy camping in because I couldn't really divorce my view of the landscape from my ideas of how fire would burn through it or how I would fight that fire if it were to burn through it, or in many landscapes, how I had fought a fire in that landscape, which was, so these landscapes they gained these layers of, really intense memories of heat waves and, people, it's an intense job. You're frequently in quite a bit of danger. Your body is at the edge of what it can handle. People are often getting hurt around you. Um, And so I think especially just holding that really embodied physicality, holding that alongside the knowledge of these also just very, very problematic historical conditions that created the conditions that you're now like suffering in as you're fighting these fires. It creates a pretty heavy space to inhabit, right?
Yeah.
But it's a space that not the quite a few people do inhabit in California as these wildfires are getting worse. And so bringing healthy fires back to landscapes is it's not just about the landscapes I've found, but it's a place where people come together around healing all these different layers because our landscapes aren't separate from us, right? They're part of us, and
Yeah.
the way that we relate to our landscapes is a part of how we relate to each other as well. So when I stopped being a wildland firefighter, I had gained some skills and some knowledge of fire by learning to navigate their edges through this job. And what I found was that there were quite a few former wildland firefighters who had joined this effort to bring good fire back. And the captain of the former captain of a hotshot crew who I met at a prescribed burn who was helping lead the burn told me that there's a whole lot of people trying to get back on the good side of fire. So people who've been fighting fires for their whole career, who have these skills now, who ally themselves with other people to bring it back. And so I went to Northern California quite often, which is where a lot of the prescribed burn movement, and it really is a social movement in California. That's where a lot of it is based. And it's a social movement in California because it is, so these things that I'm writing about these the colonial history of fire suppression in California, that's common knowledge for Indigenous people, especially in Northern California. And so when you're trying to bring good fire back, you're not just trying to prevent these catastrophic fires, you're pushing back against these dominant social and cultural and political systems that have been really trying to eliminate Indigenous people for a very long time now. So, but so it is this. So the north of California is the core of this movement, and part of what's beautiful about this process is just how fire is also bringing people together. So the alliances that you find around the efforts to bring good fire back are really diverse and unexpected. And I think it's because fire, different people relate to fire in different ways, right? So you have wildland firefighters. Um, you have you have Indigenous people, often from multiple tribes. You have people from the National Forest Service. You have people from Cal Fire. You often have like ranchers coming in because fires, when you burn fields, the grass that comes back is often far more nutrient rich because fire deposits uh, more nutrients into the soil. So you get these really beautiful communities of people all brought together around fire. And so there's that, right? You have the community, but also in order to burn in a way that benefits the ecosystem, you have to understand that ecosystem, right? So it also creates a real attention to place that is not terribly common nowadays, right? Because you can't just light a fire and expect it to go well. That's a really bad idea. You have to understand the plants. You have to understand the weather patterns, especially, well, everywhere. But in California, it's so close to the coast that you get really interesting weather patterns coming in from the ocean and the mountains and wind and all of these different things, right? So it takes a lot of local knowledge and local attention and intention as well, because different fires do different things. So, for example, up in Lake County, we did one burn with the intent of creating space for the black oak to start growing back in these areas, because there are all these trees that had been planted by logging corporations about a century ago, and they had crowded out the black oaks, which are really culturally important for that area's indigenous peoples, the Pomo peoples. And so there was that intent, right? The intent to try to create the conditions for the black oak, which is tied to the intent of the Pomo tribes in the area to try to bring back and maintain some of their cultural traditions in relation to fire and the landscape. And there really is something beautiful about being in a space like that with people who, from all different walks of life and all different parts of society, who you don't normally see allied, right? But who are brought together around fire and are trying to bring fire back. And then through that, they're building relationships with each other in what is really otherwise seems to be quite a fractured time. So at a local granular level, there's all these different, like, I guess, like heartbeats of connection that are hard to see from a broad level. But when you're in these spaces where people are trying to bring fire back, is it scalable? I don't know. But in these different contexts, people are building relationships with each other and with the land. And it's probably not going to stop climate change, but it's going to do something. And it is doing something for people and for these environments. And that's something that I've held to and that I've continued doing even after writing the book, is going to these burns, because it is a point of hope and a point of community in what is otherwise a pretty dark and frightening time.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I community is the only thing I know to keep coming back to on the podcast, because I think there are all of these big, dark, and bleak forces, that are just a part of what it is to be now. Like, we are here and it is now, and this is a part of the fabric that we are woven into. And I think that when we come together, and I think it's interesting when something like this creates an opportunity for a lot of different people to come together around a common cause. I mean, sometimes I think that's the only way we can find that sense of agency that I think we crave in a space that feels like we're just tumbling along in this thing that we can't necessarily uncouple from. And relationships, and I'll come back to, we started at the beginning of this, that fire is relational. And I think that you show that so beautifully in the book, but even throughout this podcast. I mean, we talked about all these different layers that are creating the context of both megafires and what we might do to begin to break that cycle, but also all the layers of context just for you as an individual, right? And toggling between those two spaces. That is really, I think, makes it feel easy for people to go into their communities and to build that. And I'll read... I have two quotes, and I'm really debating which one to read. But I'll start here. You're talking with Harry. Harry comes down for a prescribed burn, and I'm not going to try. I'm First Nations, British Columbia. I cannot pronounce the tribe that he's a part of. And he says, it starts here. It starts in our relationships with each other, with the land. These things aren't separate from each other. Everyone has a sphere of influence. We'll need to build relationships with each other if we want to build solutions. And I loved that. It's simple, and I think it's very true. I agree with you. I don't know if it answers a question of scale, but I think it answers something about healing. Yeah.
Thanks for reading that quote. It's it's a tension that I hold, and I think quite a few people hold, is how to balance the real gravity and difficulty of a lot of these processes unfolding in society, politically, and across the planet, and the way that those impact our lives and lives of people we love. How do you, and just balancing that with also keeping spaces of joy alive within community.
Yes.
And it's and I think that really is just a constant back and forth and a constant tension that is important to maintain and keep thinking about, because these are joyous events, these burns. People have fun. People are happy. People and it's in the backdrop of like ecological collapse. but that doesn't stop the joy from coming through. And I actually think in some cases joy can be a subversive act when there's so much inertia in the other direction. So I'm glad that quote stood out to you, because that was obviously very meaningful for me as well.
Yeah, it really did. And I joy as an act of resistance, I think, is a profound thing. And I think that, I come back to, I think our grief, if we let it, can, and it's hard to let it. And I want to say that too, right? Grief is the grief and the overwhelm at what is happening, I think, threatens to sort of anesthetize us to joy. But I think if we can hold both, and there's a great poem, and I'm gonna forget the poet and the poem, but right, that grief and joy are woven together. They're perigee and apogee. And I think, and I'll read this last quote, because I think that it talks about that active resistance really well. You say, megafires emerge from a series of fractured relationships between fire, the land, our institutions, and each other. The crowd at Clear Lake expressed optimism that these relationships were healing. Theirs was a vision of fire that didn't simply eliminate fuel, but encouraged growth. It was a vision of burning as a political act of resistance to the forces that would reduce the land and the people in it to expendable commodities. I think that encapsulates some of what you just said, and I really appreciate you and your opening up this world for us as readers, and letting us in, not just to I mean, both into these histories and this current moment of now, but also into its personal effect on you and your relationship and your grief and fear and joy. It's an incredible book.
It means a lot to me that you read it so thoughtfully. Hey, I really appreciate it.
Well,
this conversation has reflected that as well. So thank you for creating this space.
Good. Yeah. I mean, it was my pleasure. And if we missed anything, let me know. But I just want to point people towards the book and tell everyone to pick it up. And I couldn't put it down, and I couldn't stop writing in it. So it's incredible.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. That really means a lot.
Great. I'll have an intro with where people can, I'll make sure we have lots of links to the book. Thank you for taking this time with me. I really appreciate it, Jordan. And I mean it when I say I appreciated this book just immensely.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.